Watching sitcom is a way to replace the stress, tension, and unpredictability of modern life with a safe and controllable framework. Friends series, which is the story of the life of 6 normal characters, has done this well. Undoubtedly, the factor that contributed to the success of the Friends series is the relatability of its characters. Contrasts, conflicts, and interaction of these characters fascinates the viewer. Today we're going to examine the psychological aspects of all 6 characters in 3 chapters. Ross and Monica Geller are characters who are perhaps more deeply explored in the series than anyone else when it comes to their relationship and past. They were raised in a family that placed great value on success. Their mother Judy is a strict and fault-finding woman who herself was raised under the rule of a controlling and strict mother. She applied this same pattern to raising her daughter Monica and to a lesser extent Ross. We see that the core of Ross and Monica's behaviors revolves around the need for control, but they exert this control in a different manner. Both Ross and Monica are competitive individuals, and when their superiority is challenged by others, they feel threatened and become upset. However, this feeling is less intense in Ross, possibly because he was the firstborn in the family and needed less competition during his early years. Monica struggled with severe weight gain during her childhood and early adolescence, which had an impact on her self-esteem and her relationships with others. While it's not certain, it's possible that during the time when Monica couldn't meet her parents' expectations and compete with her brother, she turned to overeating to rebel against her parents and to physically compete with Ross. She eventually managed to make up for her excess weight and grow into a beautiful young woman, and at the same time uses her skills and passion for cooking to become a talented chef. But simultaneously, she pushes herself to the opposite pole of overeating and lack of control and becomes an obsessive and controlling person. In Monica's mind, there is only one right way to organize the house, and when it comes to hosting parties and events, everyone should follow Monica's lead. Otherwise, the situation becomes uncontrollable and this terrifies her. Interestingly, Monica's obsession and her desire to be the best did not transfer to her choice of partner. Her 2 serious relationships were with Richard and Chandler, who were somewhat below her in terms of age and looks. Maybe if Monica was not obese during her youth and went out with more attractive people, she wouldn't have entered into such relationships later. Of course, it could not be said that it was in her favor, because her relationships with Richard and Chandler were perhaps the best possible events for Monica. Now let's move on to Dr. Ross Geller, a man known for his 3 divorces.
Barry and Mindy are getting a divorce.
Oh my God.
Wow.
What is the matter with you?
No, Barry and Mindy.
Oh, sorry. I hear divorce, I immediately go to Ross.
Ross's control issues are a mental obsession that manifests itself in his inability to express his feelings when he talks. This mental obsession is caused by a kind of idealism that shows itself in 2 situations. The first is in expressing his desires. For years, Ross was in love with Rachel but couldn't bring himself to confess his feelings and ask her to start a relationship. The reason is that he obsessively seeks the ideal situation for this move and constantly hesitates. This mindset makes it difficult for him to approach girls he finds attractive and flirt with them. Also, the gap between his ideal statements and what he actually says causes him to stumble in his conversations. The second instance where his idealistic tendencies and obsession become apparent is when others challenge him, such as when someone questions his masculinity or competence. When someone questions his manhood or abilities, Ross strongly reacts and goes crazy. This kind of excessive protection of idealized self-perceptions usually occurs in situations where an individual views achieving a particular success as crucial. This is what Ross's family expected of him as the eldest child. The fact that Ross quickly thinks of marriage after meeting any girl is due to his insecurity and his need to create a predictable environment. Of course, as Phoebe said, Ross's suspicion and jealousy in relationships was definitely influenced by what happened in his first marriage with Carl. But you can understand that Ross did not know much about Carl at that time and was probably in a hurry to get married, which made him unable to consider the possibility of her infidelity. After the divorce, like Monica, Ross is more influenced by his mother's behavioral patterns and tries to increase his control over relationships. This makes him jealous of those who are in contact with his partner, which ultimately causes him to break up with Rachel and to have problems in his relationship with his second wife, Emily. Let's highlight 2 interesting aspects that show how mentally uptight Ross is. First is when Rachel asks him about his sexual fantasies, where Ross has to think a lot, and eventually he recalls a scene from Princess Leia in Star Wars. This scene illustrates that Ross even regulates his fantasies and imposes many rules on himself. The other one is where he says Rachel's name during his wedding with Emily. It is shown that he is so mentally preoccupied with Rachel that he mentions her name in the wedding vows instead of his wife's name.
Emily, take thee Rachel.
Which is a significant example of how Ross cannot escape from his mental frameworks he has created for himself. Ross and Monica, like all of us, have been influenced by their past and their family upbringing, and what happened to them cannot be considered trauma. This is not the case with Chandler Bing and Phoebe Buffay. The events that happened to Chandler and Phoebe in their childhood were so painful that forced them to adapt by developing unconditional traits to cope with this unusual world. Phoebe's father left her family when she was a child, and her mother committed suicide when she was only 14 years old. After that, Phoebe lived on the streets for a while. The details of Phoebe's past are confusing for the viewers. For example, her stepfather is a character we hear about, and apparently Phoebe had a good relationship with him. However, for unclear reasons, he ends up in jail. Similarly, it is unclear why Phoebe doesn't live with her grandmother after her mother's suicide. In any case, these unpleasant events turn Phoebe into an eccentric character. It is entirely reasonable to assume that Phoebe has minimized the material world in her mind and lives in a fantasy world that is justified by spiritual and metaphysical dimensions. In the series, she constantly talks about communicating with her mother's spirit or weird connection with other people. In this way, she escapes from the pain caused by the loss of her loved ones. Her choice of clothing and singing style also reflects her free spirit. She tries to establish a special form of connection with others by buying used clothes and items. An indirect connection that goes beyond any physical or material communication. When it comes to handling life's ups and downs, Phoebe always looks on the bright side. She tends to focus on the positive aspects of any situation and buries the negative aspects under a mask of optimism. However, when things start to go awry and she feels like she's losing control, Phoebe's reactions become quite intense. She resorts to yelling or getting physically involved. This sudden change in behavior shows that there is a contrast between her usual optimism and her need to take charge when things get tough. We also see in some cases that Phoebe is oblivion to a fairly obvious point, which shows an unconscious lack of insight. By ignoring the reality of the external world and opting for an alternative interpretation, Phoebe protects herself from getting hurt. We see a similar mechanism of self-protection in her tendency to speak without thinking. She often blurts out things that should be kept secret or that don't fit with social norms. And by revealing others' secrets, she tries to minimize the damage and prevent situations from getting worse in her own weird way. Now let's move on to Chandler Bing. Like Phoebe, he also has a painful past. But unlike her, his past wounds were not caused by permanent loss, and as a result he used different ways to cope with these events. Chandler's parents were separated after his father finds out that he is transsexual, and because of their inattention, they choose the worst time and way to tell their son about this. Chandler, who was only 9 years old at that time, like all children at that age, at least partly blames himself for the separation of his parents, and consequently became hypersensitive to any sign of trouble. In Chandler's mind, there is no distance between a bad situation and a critical one. We can see this issue in the way he reacted after Ross and Rachel break up in his bizarre behavior. This crisis perception bias also makes Chandler unable to help others when they ask for help. By excluding himself as an available option, Chandler escapes from the responsibilities and possible consequences of unlucky events. In the same way, he replaces direct and serious interaction with humor and sarcasm to reduce the stress of close interpersonal relationships and create a kind of emotional distance between himself and the other party. Chandler's jokes are a way to cope with his low self-confidence.
I'm Chandler, I make jokes when I'm uncomfortable.
In emotional relationships with his partners, he is usually confused and gets stuck between the fear of being alone and the fear of commitment and intimacy. This is why he repeatedly enters and exits relationships with Janice and Joanna. In close relationships, saying no is challenging for Chandler, and he usually accompanies his refusals with sarcasm or humor. This way, ending a relationship is reduced to a joke and less responsibility is placed on him. Before we go to the last chapter, we have got a favor to ask. We spend a lot of time preparing these videos, and it would mean a lot to us if you could support us by hitting the subscribe button. Joey Tribbiani and Rachel Green are two characters who throughout the series are on a journey to achieve independence and define their own identities. Let's start with Rachel. From the very first episode, after fleeing from a traditional marriage that affluent women of that era pursued to secure ideal financial lives, she is in pursuit of breaking free from the dependencies her family has imposed on her. Living life on a waiter's salary is challenging, but Rachel is excited about the prospect of standing on her own feet, experiencing a small independent life, and having unconditional relationships with her friends. Before separating from her family, her father controlled almost every aspect of Rachel's life. Although Dr. Green loves her daughter, as a successful and wealthy doctor, he tries to dictate his own specific rules to everyone and take control of his family members' activities. His priorities revolve around maintaining a patriarchal environment in his family life. Love, affection, and comfort for family members are contingent on fulfilling these priorities. This control is to the extent that he even tempts her with offering of buying a Mercedes to lure her back into the family framework. This way of managing the family prevents Rachel from pursuing her own desires and true interests. Consequently, in her teenage years and beyond, Rachel becomes a carefree girl who takes everything, such as her education and relationships, lightly. And later, when she wants to become independent, she struggles in making big decisions and finds herself more easily influenced by others. If we look carefully, we can see that Rachel hardly makes any significant decisions before becoming independent, and the choices she makes depend on fulfilling momentary desires. In such circumstances, where life doesn't move beyond shallow choices, the consequences of decisions are also usually reversible. For example, if Rachel didn't like something she bought or her boyfriend, she could always change them. So we shouldn't blame Rachel for occasionally seeming superficial and flighty, but instead we should congratulate her on her determination to change her life and say no to a comfortable yet superficial life. Rachel's hidden attachment to her father is evident in her attraction to doctors and rich people. Her strong interest in the fashion industry is also somewhat within this framework. Rachel tries to stay within this industry to always be close to luxury goods and the latest fashion trends so she can continue to experience a high-quality life, at least visually. Even in her relationships, people that Rachel herself chooses and becomes fond of are physically attractive, but apart from that, are not suitable for her in terms of personal circumstances or traits. Her relationship with Ross had many ups and downs, however, in a way it allowed her to cope with the challenges of a more serious relationship in a controlled environment and make personal progress. Now let's check out the dumb and lovable character of the show, Joey.
Hey, how you doing?
The key to understand Joey's character is his hedonism. For him, eating, sex, and having a good time are not events to be postponed. Joey even sleeps with actresses and stage crew at his workplace, and apparently he cannot understand how this can affect his career. It is possible that being the only boy in a family with 7 girls has affected his behavior toward women, in such a way that he dares to approach any woman without expecting rejection. Growing up in such a family could have led to Joey remaining somewhat childlike even in adulthood, struggling to delay his desires and facing the responsibilities of the adult life. Throughout the show, he remains dependent on Chandler for his financial needs, which shows that Joey is not able to handle his life as effectively as needed. Nonetheless, his simplicity and physical attractiveness somehow help him get away with things. Joey may generally seem dumb, but in matters of relationships, he can be even smarter than Ross and Chandler. Therefore, his foolishness in other domains might stem from his indifference and laziness. Perhaps Joey doesn't consider other aspects of life important enough to bother learning about them. This possibility becomes more apparent in the scene where Joey buys an encyclopedia and starts talking about the topics he has learned. There is an interesting contrast between Joey's struggle for independence and his superior power and ability to attract the opposite sex. Joey expends a lot of mental energy on certain tasks such as memorizing lines or defending his friends, but he struggles to meet society's expectations of an adult. Although it is commendable to follow attitudes and beliefs about life, it causes Joey trouble in achieving balance in his life. He is really lucky to have a good friend like Chandler who helps him compensate for his shortcomings. Otherwise, Joey would have many more problems in life. Thank you for your time. Be sure to watch our other videos.